Today's daf is daf Kuf, and we're going to start here on Tzadi Tes Omid Beis with Eino Cholek Lechol, which is a quote from the Mishnah, which you'll see approximately 12 lines down from the top of the Omud. The first word in the line is Rabbanon, and we're talking about the rights of the Kohen to take a share in the Basar HaKarbon that's eaten Lezichre Kahuna, and those are legal rights that are granted as a general rule, according to the Torah law, to all Kohanim. However, the Rabbanon, back in the time already of Moshe Rabbeinu, made a takana of mishmaros, that there are different mishmaros, the 24 mishmaros, that are groups of Kohanim that do the avodah. Each one of the mishmaros gets a week in the first half of the year, and then a second week in the second half of the year. And the mishmaros themselves give special rights to the families of the Kohanim, especially the Kohen who does the avoda. The Kohen who does the avoda is actually a representative of all the Kohanim. In any event, the Mishnah states that an Onain who lost one of his close relatives, Nebuch, and it's before the Kfura, he does not get a share in the Basar HaKarbon. And the reason for that is because the Onain is not part, even though he's a Kohen, he's not part of the Avodah. He can't do the Avodah. Now, the Mishnah says that he is excluded from a share in the Basar, but the implication is that although he doesn't get a Zchus Momon, he doesn't have the monetary rights to claim the Basar, but nevertheless he can eat the Basar. Miflag Hudalo Polik. But v'chimizamni le ochil. Apparently, if the other kohanim invite him to eat from the basar, he can eat. Uraminui, but that's against the Mishnah in Masechta Psachim. The Mishnah says that onein tovel v'ochel es pischo la'erev. There was a special permission for the onain to eat from the basar pesach on the night of Tesvav bin Nisan because of the severity of the mitzvah of Karban Pesach, Avalo B'Kodshim. But other karbanos, other kodshim, he's not allowed to eat from. So it seems that the underlying premise of the Mishnah in Psachim is that an onain is prohibited from eating the karbanos, and that even applies, and that's the big chiddush, for the night after his aninus. And there was only a special dispensation that was made for the Korban Pesach because, as we said before, of the severity of the Korban Pesach. So how do we reconcile our Mishnah, which seems to indicate that the Onain is allowed to eat Basar Kodshim, just that he doesn't demand a share in the division of the Basar, with the Mishnah in Psachim that clearly indicates that the Onain, cannot eat Kodshim, Lomi Boy, on the day of his Aninus, but even on the night following his Aninus. And here we're going to have Rav Yirmiyah Midifti and Rav Asi each respectively offering a reconciliation of this contradiction. First, we start with Rav Yirmiyah. Olo kasha kan b'Pesach, kan b'shar yemos ha-shona. The Mishnah in Psachim, which clearly indicates that the Onain is not allowed to eat Kodshim, that's talking Shar Yemos Hashana, the rest of the days of the year, whereas our Mishnah, that seems to imply that the Kohen Onain is only excluded from demanding a share in the division of the Basar, but can eat the Basar. That's talking about Pesach. And here the Gemara is going to introduce a principle called ID. ID means like a migu kind of thing. Pesach, ID di ochel Pesach, ochel nami kodshim. Once the halacha allows the onain on the night following his aninus, which is the tesvav benisa to eat the korban pesach, then the Rabbanan allowed him to eat all the kodshim. And that's called Aidi di Ochel B'Pesach Ochel Nami B'Gu. But on Shariamos Hashana, there, where there's no dispensation for the Korban Pesach is concerned, then we go back to the main Ikar Adin, and that is that he cannot eat kodshim. Is b'shayimos hashana delo chazi, right? We don't have again this heter to eat korban pesach lo chazi. Then we won't give him any other kodshim, any other karbonos. Umay. And now, if you're saying that there's a special dispensation for the onain on the night of Pesach, I mean, avalo bekodshim, it means avalo bekodshim shall kol hashana. In other words, we're not saying that he can't eat kodshim on the night of Pesach. On the night of Pesach, he will eat kodshim, because once they allowed him to eat Pesach, they allowed him to eat all karbonos. But when the Mishnah Psachim says avalo bekodshim, it's referring to kodshim b'shayimos Hashem. Ravasi probably finds this very difficult, I'm assuming, because it says Tovil v'yochel pischo avalo bekodshim. It sounds like we're talking about the same night, and you're going to put a stop here in the middle of the Mishnah and say avalo bekodshim is referring to the rest of the days of the year. But therefore, Ravasi says to reconcile this contradiction, Lo kasha kan shemes lo mes ba'arba asar. The Mishnah Psachim, which prohibits him from eating kodshim, is talking about a scenario in which his relative died on the 14th of Nisan, ukvoro be'arba'asa. So on the 14th of Nisan is both the Yom Misa and the Yom Kvura, because both the death and the burial took place on that day. So since the death took place not earlier, before the Korban Pesach and its obligation was set in, but rather it took place on the 14th. Let's clarify that. Kan shemeslo mes b'shloshasar. Our Mishnah, which allows him to eat from kodshim, even though he's an onain, and he's only excluded, as we said before, from cutting a share in the division. That's a case when the mes died on the 13th and was buried ukvaro bi'arbos on the 14th. And that's why the Mishnah implies that he's allowed to eat from kodshim, because he's not really a full-fledged onain. Because the real moment in time that generates aninus is the moment of the death of his relative, which took place on the 13th. So now the kvura took place on the next day, on the 14th, and therefore it's already aninus derabanan, meaning aninus min Torah biblically is when the misa and the kvura took place on the same day. But if the misa took place yesterday and kvura took place today, then today is only aninus derabanan, and therefore the rabbanan were lenient and they allowed him to eat kodshim. But if the Yom Kvura was on the 14th, and I'm sorry, the Yom Misa was on the 14th, and the Yom Kvura was likewise on the 14th, then he's a full-fledged onain. And then we're going to say Tafis Lelo the Lila, the night after his Aninus, is also an extension of the Aninus. So again, when you have Aninus Doraisa, which means that the 14th was the day of both Misa and Kfura, then we say that the Leila is Tofus, that even the night after Aninus is an extension of Aninus, and we're not going to allow him to eat Kodesh. Whereas if the Yom Misa was a day earlier and the Yom Kvura was a day later, and then the Yom Kvura is only Aninus Derabanan, the Rabbanan are going to suspend the principle of Tofis Lelo, and the night after his Aninus, he's allowed to eat Kodesh. But we have to keep in mind here that this halacha of Tfisas Laila, that the night following his Aninus is also an extension of his Aninus, that itself is a derabanan. And the Rabbanan are not going to apply that in the case of Achilas Kodesh. Man Tana Aninus Laila min Rabbanan. Where is the source in our Tanaic literature for a shita that maintains that the night following Aninus is not Doraisa? Because keep in mind, the Kvura has the right. We're talking about the night after Kvura, and we assumed until this point that the extension of Aninus vis-a-vis Achilles Kodshim was for the night after Aninus, after the Kvura, was Doraisa. Where is there a source for the premise that the night after the Aninus is only the Rabbanan? And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Shimoni Desanya. We learned it from Shimon in a brisa. Aninus Laila midivrei Torah divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda maintains that Aninus on a Doraisa level extends and includes the night after the Kvura, whereas Rabbi Shimon Omer Onein Eino midivrei Torah el midivrei Sofrim. The night following his Kvura, as an extension to Aninus, is only a creation of the Rabbanan. Teda, and here's Reb Shimon's proof, Sharei Omru Onein Tovel v'ocheles Pischo la'erev. That an Onein can immerse himself for the Achilas Kodshim of Korban Pesach and eat the Korban Pesach the night after his Kvura, the Kvura of his mess, which means that the Rabbanan were able to be lenient in order to bend the law, allowing him to eat the Korban Pesach, which is, as we said before, a high-powered mitzvah, if the Aninus and the Isra Achilas Kodshim is only the Rabbanan. So Reb Shimon is basically throwing out an attack here against the phantom Chachamim, who might say, like Rabbi Yehuda maintains, that after the night after the Kvura of an Onen is also Da'oraisa, and he says, if that be the case, how could the law, the mitzvah of Achilas Korban Pesach, how could it override an Isa Da'oraisa? The answer must be that Laila after Aninus is only the Rabbanan. And if it's only the Rabbanan found a powerful reason not to insist on an Iser Achilas Kodshim at the expense of forfeiting the mitzvah of Achilas Pesach. Okay, so Ad Kan HaKofa Aleph, and now we're really beginning the kishkis of the sugya, because the Gemara now is going to present a contradiction between one brisa of Reb Shimon, the one that we learned now, and another brisa of Reb Shimon, and we're going to see 5 different answers to reconcile that contradiction. Let me just add one point before we go on. I said over and over again that Pesach and the mitzvah of Achilas HaPesach is a high-powered, stringent mitzvah. And let me add the following. That is, that if a person is negligent and he doesn't bring the Korban Pesach, he's chayav kares. There are only 2 mitzvos in the Torah where non-fulfillment generates courage. That's Mila and Korban Pesach. So we're dealing with, as I said before, a very strict mitzvah. And the Rabbanan are going to say, you know what? Instead of imposing our Isser that we invented, that the night after Aninis is also Bachil's Kodshim, and at that point forfeit the great mitzvah of Achilas HaPesach, we're going to say that we never prohibited the Onen in that case where he'll forfeit the mitzvah of Pesach. The Sover Rab Shimon Aninis Laila ben Rabbanon. You just quoted a brisa, and in that brisa, Rabbi Shimon went on record explicitly as saying that Onen, as far as Lila is concerned, the night after the Kfur is only Drabanan. But here's a brisa, Tanya Rabbi Shimon Omer, Onen Einem Shablech Korbanosov. Rabbi Shimon made a general statement, which, without any exceptions, that an Onen cannot send his korbanos. He's not included in the mitzvah of kodshim. My love, afilu v'pesach. Since he didn't qualify, it's unqualified. It seems to assume that this law that excludes an onen from korbanos applies even to the korban pesach. In other words, Reb Shimon says that the adin of aninus excludes a korban pesach. Now, Pesach is eaten at night. It's not eaten during the day. So when we assume that Rabbi Shimon's statement in the second brisa, excluding an onen from korbanos, applies to korban Pesach, it must be the night after the kvura. So you see that aninus of Lila is doraisa, and that's why it precludes him from korban Pesach. So the Gemara first wants to say, no, there's no contradiction, lo. And when Rabbi Shimon said, as an unqualified statement, that an onen does not eat his kodshim, that's labarmi Pesach. You have to exclude korban Pesach. It wasn't an all-inclusive general statement that included Pesach. No, take Pesach out of the picture. So now it says that Rabbi Shimon holds that an onen brings his korban Pesach because the night after his kvura is only the Rabbana. The Rabbana would not impose an iser achilas kodshim to the to the effect that that undermines him from eating a korban Pesach. So again, right now, if we say lebarmi Pesach, then the Gemara's answer would cover us, and the final conclusion that according to Reb Shimon, Lila is the Rabbanan, and therefore there's no Isser eating korban Pesach. Frek the Gemara of Hatanya. What about the following brayso that says Rabbi Shimon Omer Shlomim Shu Shlomim Mevi Ve'edu Mevi Kishu Onen? Now, what's very important for us here at this juncture is to see the pasuk, because the pasuk has many, many parts to it. It's a pasuk in Vayikra, Perek Gimel, and we're going to darshan every single part of the pasuk. V'im zevach shlomim karbono im min abakar hu makriv im zachar im nekeva tomim yakrivu lifnei Hashem. So the Torah itself calls this karma by the name shlomim. The word shlomim is not a syntax that was invented by the rabbis. And what is the meaning of the word shlomim for our halachic discussion? Kshu sholem. Sholem means when he's in a state of simcha. He's in a state of joy. However, if he's an onen, and he just buried or he just lost one of his close relatives, he's hardly in a state of joy, he's excluded from a korban shlomim. Okay, let's assume that that's a special halach in shlomim because the Torah calls it by its name, that he's sholem. Minayin l'rabos satoda. And now the Gemara is going to ask the question whether Toda has the same status of Simcha and that requirement as Shlomim, and therefore it excludes an Onen. Marba Aniyas HaToda Shekenechels B'Simcha Kishlomim. Toda, when he thanks God by bringing this carbon for one of the four categories in which he's chayav a carbon Toda, has to be brought B'Simcha. He is celebrating with joy the fact that God saved him from a disaster. How do we know that Ola likewise is a carbon that requires Simcha? In other words, whereas certain carbonos, the situation and the reality that you find yourself in generates an obligation to bring a carbon. Not so in the case of an Ola. Nothing obligates him. He took it upon himself to bring the Ola on a voluntary basis. And the very fact that he can do it voluntarily makes Ola very similar to Shlomim, as opposed to, we'll see other cases where there's no Nedava, like Bechor and Maser and Chatos and Oshem. None of these karbonos can be brought b'nedava voluntarily. So in that case, Ola belongs to the same category as Shlomim. Minay l'rabos Bechor Maser Pesach. Here are three cases where there's no possibility of voluntarily bringing the carbon, and yet we're going to exclude an onen. And the most important part of this entire discussion in this brisa is the word Pesach. That Pesach is antithetical to an onen, because Marba ani b'choru maser peshakein enam boim alachet, because any carbon like Shlomim, which is in no way connected to sin, to chet, is ba b'simcha. And if it's ba b'simcha, that excludes an onen. Minay l'rabos chatas v'yoshim. Should we say the chatas v'yoshim, that's ba lachet, therefore can be brought by an onen? Tabelomer zevach. The Torah added an extra superfluous word zevach to teach me that includes even chatas v'yoshim, despite the fact that the machayev of chatas v'yoshim is chet. Nevertheless, it's still, I guess you could say, again, philosophically, maybe the opportunity to bring a carbon chatas, to bring a carbon osham, and achieve atonement for sin, that itself requires or generates simcha, and therefore no need is excluded. Right, these are five cases where the offerings have nothing to do with sin. For example, menachos and yayin, right? He offers voluntarily to bring niskei yayin or levona. I mean, take, for example, eitzim, right? Eitzim is purely nedava. Whoever wanted to contribute for the wood of the fires of the pyre of the mizbeach, he would do so. So that none of these cases really fit into the extra ribui of zevach, which came to be marbe osham and chatas. Talmud loma shlomim karbono. Apparently, the Torah adds an extra term karbono to include that karbono, meaning the potential carbon of him being an onen, is excluded. Kol karbonos mevi kshu sholem mevi. If he's in a state of sholem, he can bring the carbon. Veinu mevi kshu onen. Okay, let's get back to the main word for our purposes, the punchline of this whole brisa, katonimia, Pesach. It says clearly in the name of Reb Shimon that an onen is excluded from a carbon Pesach. And yet Reb Shimon himself said that an onen is tovel v'ochel mipischo balayla. And on this we're going to have five resolutions, five different approaches as to how to reconcile, five reconciliations. First, we start with Rav Chizda. Pesach Kedinazba. Take out the word Pesach. Somehow it got schlepped in, but really, as far as Pesach is concerned, the Onen is allowed to eat the Korban Pesach. And then Rav Shimon L'Shitasa. Now number two, Rav Sheshes. My Pesach, Shalmei Pesach. Now I thought that Shalmei Pesach means that he set aside an extra Korban Pesach in the event that the first one gets lost. But Rashi says not like that. And we're talking about a Korban Chagiga. Now let's explain. The Pesach has to be eaten al hasova, right, when you're already full. But the problem is that there's not enough basar in the Pesach for you to get full, because you have to divide it up amongst all the members of the Chabura, or maybe it's a small skinny lamb, I don't know what. So in order to guarantee that the Pesach would be eaten bis ala sova, meaning that last bit of room that he has in his stomach until he's absolutely satiated, that will be eaten b'korban Pesach. So what we do is we bring a korban chagiga, and the chagiga is called Shalmei Pesach, meaning it's the makeup, so to speak, or the complementary, part of the korban Pesach. So that's Rav Sheshes. Now, let's point out here that both Rav Chizda and Rav Sheshes agree fundamentally that as far as the Iser Onein for Achilas Korbanos, Pesach is excluded. The only difference between Rav Chizda and Rav Sheshes is how to explain that price that seems to indicate that the Iser of Onein applies even to Pesach. Rav Chizda just simply takes it out. And Rav Sheshes says that it's a reference not to Pesach, but rather to the Chagiga. If we're talking about the Korban Chagiga, Hainu Shlomim, I mean, the Mishnah itself starts, the Bryce itself opens up, kicks off with Shlomim. Now you're going to have a special limud, a special yalfusa, because it's a Chagiga. Chagiga is Shlomim. Tana Shloma Boy Machmas Pesach, Tana Shloma Boy Machmas Atzmon. There are two categories of Shlomim. One is a shlomim, which is essentially a korban shlomim. The other is a korban shlomim that sort of comes through the back door. It's ba machmas ha-pesach. Salke dait chamin, I would have thought, hoilu machmas pesach osi kegufe de pesach dami. Why not consider the chagiga as an addendum, as an addition to the Korban Pesach, because it's only being brought for the sake of the Korban Pesach and the mitzvah thereof. And therefore, just like the Korban Pesach, we allowed the Onen to eat Belel HaPesach. So too, we're going to allow him to eat the Chagiga in order to prepare himself for the full-fledged Kiyum mitzvah of Pesach. Kamash Malon, that's what Shimon wants to teach us. No. That although for the Korban Pesach itself will be matir, will permit the Onen to eat for the Korban Pesach, but not for the Chagiga, even though the Chagiga is coming in order to facilitate the Kiyum mitzvah Pesach. So now we have two answers, and we can continue to emphasize that according to both answers, Rabbi Shimon holds that there's no Iser Onen as far as the Achilas Pesach. And now we're up to Rav Mori Omar, and we start Daf Kuf.